One of my all-time favorite mystical monsters and creatures has always been the vampire. Ask any of my hundreds of players that's gathered around my D&D table for years to join in on some of that wicked good lore and gameplay. Now, I know Bill also has a fascination with these creatures, playing not only D&D, but also Vampire the Masquerade for many years.
Vampire the Masquerade was a big fixture of my late teens and early 20s.
And I want to, but I still haven't gotten into that.
Yeah.
But so it was a logical subject for our podcast, and especially it sparked my interest when he mentioned vampires of the United States, and in particular, maybe we could find some in Missouri. He mentioned the vampire tunnels in Springfield, which was a new twist that just whet my bloodlust, so to speak. On one of the stories I decided to cover tonight, it's actually one that Bill touched upon in one of our Halloween specials.
I think you're going to go into more detail. I just told the folk tale, so I think you're going to get into some of the background.
I hope I'm going to do my best to add to it and not let you down. But while we agreed to focus mostly on the home state of Missouri, we're going to flutter and creep around to a few other blood-curdling tales all over the good old USA involving vampiric tales. So join us if you dare.
From a child born into this world, we are taught what to believe. Closed-minded we become, fearful to be deceived. Still we desire to know what lies beyond that locked door. The art of the storyteller, conjuring tales of legend and lore. History hidden, lost knowledge, things forgotten and the unknown. These are the things that direct us and will set the tone. Welcome, friends, to another episode of Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
So, I've said this many times when we're looking for ideas and topics. I stumble across a lot of things on Reddit that kind of start me down different rabbit holes. And like Eric said, I played Vampire the Masquerade for years. The amount of money I spent on Vampire the Masquerade books is irresponsible, to say the least. And, you know, in hindsight, maybe I wouldn't have spent so much money because I don't know about you, but I did not end up using all of the books at some point.
Oh, so. I think that's normal with any game.
But they were fascinating to read. And yeah,
there could have been worse things you could have been doing with your money and time, you know.
Well, and when I was in my teens, I developed this fascination for vampires. Of course, Interview with the Vampire is still one of my favorite movies.
Oh,
I had a book called
Close to the Heart.
Yeah. I had a book called The Vampire Book, which was probably about 3 inches thick and basically was an encyclopedia of vampire knowledge. And I read it cover to cover because I was just that person.
This was before glitter vampires, too.
Yeah, definitely. Way before that. I even went through a goth phase that stopped just short of wearing makeup and nail polish. I mean, I wore like a silver cross that had skulls on it, and I went as a vampire every year to Halloween parties. And
absolutely.
But
the younger years.
Yeah, I was fascinated. So, of course, when I stumbled upon something that talked about the vampire tunnels underneath Springfield, Missouri, I thought, well, that's mighty close to home. And if we got vampires, kind of want to know about that. So,
I want to go visit them.
So I started doing my research once we decided to pick this topic and learned quickly that the vampire tunnels of Springfield, Missouri are not what you think they are. And also that it wasn't going to be enough for a full episode. So, like Eric said, we're going to wander around a little bit. And I tried to stay in the surrounding states, but I did find one really, really neat story from Wisconsin that I liked. I actually found that one this morning when I was trying to flesh out the details. But I'm going to start with the original topic. We're talking about the Springfield, Missouri vampire tunnels. And what I have written right here was what I was going to use as my intro if Eric didn't go, which was, what strange things lurk beneath Springfield, Missouri in the dark of night? What strange things lurk in the dark underground? Now, some people claim that there are a series of strange vampire tunnels beneath the sister city. Now, this is backed up by some actual history in the form of the Jordan Creek tunnels. Now, part of these tunnels date back to the 1800s. There was Jordan Creek, which ran through Springfield. Jordan Creek was prone to flooding from time to time, but it was also in a place where Springfield started to expand. They would sort of need to either go around or go over Jordan Creek. And so what they decided to do was go over Jordan Creek. They basically built a bridge, kind of, sort of, but they kind of covered Jordan Creek over, and then they built Springfield on top of the covering eventually.
And as they say, if you build it, they will come.
Well, so now you have the Jordan Creek tunnels, which, again, you know, from the 1800s all the way up to the 1950s, they worked on and expanded. It just funnels Jordan Creek under the city and helps control its floodwaters when there's, heavy rainfall.
Now, honestly, that does sound a little weird, but all through history, cities are built upon whatever, tunnels, older cities.
Yeah, if you want to take it to the extreme, just think about New Orleans, where half the city is technically below, or the whole city is below sea level.
Yeah, we got a low spot here. Let's just throw some sand in it and we'll build on top of it.
And then you wonder why it floods when there's hurricanes.
It's amazing.
Now, of course, the experts will tell you there are no vampires in the tunnel. The tunnel currently I think it falls under city utilities, kind of, sort of. I don't know the exact name for the organization, but they do offer tours of the tunnels. So if it was plagued with vampires, it probably wouldn't be too safe to go down there. Now, you will see the occasional fish in the stream, and there are bats, but they're not vampire bats. Just simple little Missouri bats when we don't have any native vampire bats in Missouri, if my reading was
Probably the little
correct.
brown bats.
Yeah, the size of your thumb. They're not going to, if they did latch onto you, you might have to worry about rabies, but at least that was the story my aunt always told me growing up. She was terrified. They had a security light outside their house, and I remember we were there one night, we came there, and there were bats flying around it, and my aunt made us put our hands over our heads and duck as we ran into the house so the bats wouldn't get in our hair.
Bizarre.
I guess that was just what they thought. She's not the only person that I've heard tell me that.
I've been in hundreds of caves. And,
yeah.
Of course, you stir them up and they'll float around. They'll freak you out. I don't care who you are, but.
Now, while there may not be any official documented vampires in the vampire tunnels, there is the story of Lacalia Wiggins, and it does tie in a little bit.
Do tell.
So Lacalia was a 15-year-old prodigy student at Drury University, and she was just looking to fit in. She was approached one day at the Springfield Library, and, I would imagine being 15 years old in college, you stand out a little bit.
You would have to.
You don't fit in.
Yeah.
And so probably if anybody comes to you and treats you special and
gives you attention,
gives you that attention, you might fall in with the wrong crowd. Well, maybe she was just a little more receptive to the message that she received than most people would have been when this stranger at the library told her that she'd been a vampire queen in a previous life.
Wow, that's a claim.
It was obvious, they said, by her eyes and the shape of her ears. And she would later go on to say that they believe I am a vampire queen. They just need to awaken me. It's nice to be accepted like that. Exactly. She was, at 15 years old, a prodigy in college. Like I said, she probably was, that's a weird social position to be in.
Well, she was obviously gifted.
Yeah. So this strange encounter would lead Lacalia into the underground tunnels of Springfield to meet vampires. And over the next 2 months, she became learned in all things related to vampire lore while she visited their hideouts beneath the city. And in those hideouts, she would watch the members of the group taste each other's blood, all while keeping these meetings a secret from her parents. They didn't know what she was doing. But again, 15-year-old college student, she's out and about. Maybe they thought she had a more active social life. I'm not sure. They suspected nothing of their daughter's vampiric escapades. But yeah, she said they would cut themselves, suck blood from each other's wounds, and that they had a meeting place that they called Hell's Church. And to access this underground lair, which of course was in the Jordan Creek tunnels, you had to scale the tunnel wall to get there, and the entrance is easy to miss unless you know where to find it. But above the drainage way, there is a large room where Lacalia said the groups of 20-plus members lived for a while, calling it the house. This group was mainly composed of kids her age or younger, with some older members, and a man in his mid-20s that acted as their ringleader. Her situation came to a head, if you will, on Halloween, when Lacalia ran away that morning, and of course her mother panicked when she couldn't find her, and a missing persons report was filed right away, and officers caught up to Lacalia that night near Central Park Square.
I'm having total Lost Boy vibes.
Yeah, it's very, very similar kind of. She and her friends were going to cut her hair and then travel to a Springfield cemetery where the vampire queen within her would be awakened. In her own words, they have a ceremony. You have to drink the blood of a vampire, and they have to drink your blood.
So I'm just following along here. Up to this point, she had witnessed other people cutting themselves and drinking. She probably hadn't partaken yet.
It doesn't say that she did. I'm assuming she hadn't been.
Until she's initiated,
until she's ready,
brought forth.
Well, police found her. They returned her home and said that she was cooperative with them, but that night she was anything but cooperative with her parents. She hissed at her mother and her stepfather as well as the family dog. She called her parents humans in a very derogatory fashion. Now, with counseling, she has since returned to a relative normalcy. However, life for her is still strange. Lacalia says she still receives death threats from her former friends, noting that they intended to cut her tongue out and being told by strangers sometimes just for no reason that she will die.
Wow.
It is such a strange story, in fact, that her mother, a first grade teacher, was placed on leave from her job just for talking about it with her coworkers. Now,
I think that's called censorship.
Well, I mean, a job's entitled to do.
I know.
She works at an elementary school. Maybe.
Kids, today we're going to learn about what lurks below your city.
Yeah, now, there is some evidence to support her story, since her stepfather did go into the tunnels and did retrieve her backpack from, quote, the house. That was after she had left the clan and returned home. Now, I do have another story from Springfield, which is, again, vampiric slightly, but not quite. And you'll understand as we go. There's the 2016 story of 19-year-old Victoria Venator.
That's a nice vampire name.
It kind of is. I didn't think about it when I read it. She was taken into custody at the Greene County Jail on Thanksgiving night, 2016. After being taken in, she would tell police that she and her boyfriend had been talking about vampires, and he said he wanted to suck someone's blood. She said that he could suck her blood, and so he cut her forearm with a box cutter. Ouch.
That's very romantic.
Yeah. Well, and drank her blood right there in the kitchen. Now, according to Venator's own words, after a while, she started to feel woozy.
I can imagine.
She started to she used the term blackout, but I don't know how accurate that may be.
Roses are red, blood is too. Let me do this unto you.
Okay. Freaked me out a little bit. Venator decided she didn't like allowing him to suck her blood at that point, so she grabbed a knife and started stabbing him.
It's all off. Get away from me.
So realizing she may have seriously injured him when she came back to herself, she called 911, but he jumped up and grabbed the phone from her. But he didn't hang up soon enough, and as everybody knows, if you don't hang up on 911,
they get you.
They come anyway. So police were dispatched to the house, and at first, Venator's boyfriend wouldn't let them in. They could see he was covered in blood, and they could hear there was a woman in the house, so they tried to force their way in. Finally, Venator opened the door for the police to come in, and they saw that she was covered in blood, and there was a man in the room bleeding from knife wounds. And his wounds included open wounds on the front and back of his left shoulder, a bleeding cut on his lower back, and a cross drawn in blood on his chest.
Whoa.
Now, he was described by officers as uncooperative and refused to tell the cops what happened. He insisted the wounds were self-inflicted at the time.
Yeah, okay.
There were also hearts scrawled on the walls with blood and the words, "I'm sorry," written underneath one of them.
I'm sorry.
Now, while in custody, Venator told police detectives that she was a threat to society, that they needed to take her seriously, and that she believed she had the capacity to become a serial killer. Not exactly a vampire story, but vampire related.
Close enough related. Well, I'm going to touch on one, as I said in the opening, that my good buddy here, Bill, actually touched upon in one of our Halloween specials. But
I told it was the last Halloween special we did. So I told the story of it.
And, of course, when I'm doing vampire research for Missouri, this one also pops up.
Yeah, I found it again, too. So,
and I did as deep a dive as I could on it. Was able, I think, to get some new information. So, hopefully, Bill, I won't let you down. And feel free to jump in. Did the area of Elvins, or now Park Hills region of Missouri, have a real vampire living there in the late 1800s? Orland, possibly his first name, Gibson, had 3 children, 2 of which were twin boys named Samuel and Daniel. There is what is known as the Gibson Cemetery. Now, originally that was started back in about 1824, and at the time it was exclusive for the Gibson family. However, later on it was used for some of the other locals. Now, it is stated Mr. Gibson, possibly this Orland Gibson, a name in much of the research that you try to do, there is no name. So I'm making some loops here. I did some research, tried to tie it in, found at least one other researcher that also believed the name is Orland. The children, the number of children, the twins kind of all match. So we're going to throw that out there as a possibility, but Orland Gibson. Anyhow, it states that Mr. Gibson was a Hungarian immigrant who had stark white hair, kind of a pale powdery skin, and even a pink, or some would say red eyes.
Now, if I remember the story correctly, they said he was an albino.
They do believe now,
yeah,
with information that, wasn't fully understood back then, that he was simply an albino. And I did find some research that the twin boys also exhibited albinoism. That was one of the links that said, okay, well, We got the Gibson name. We've got a possible albino. Here's two twin boys. It stands to reason that they belong to him, kind of tying together some of those. Now, legends dictate that he was never seen out in the daylight. He preferred either inside in his home or to only be out at night. But it is said that he was a very hard-working, strong man who seemed to really enjoy his job deep within the lead mines nearby in which he was employed. During a period of about 12 to 15 years, several small children in the area were reported missing or deceased, which added to this lore of the story that Mr. Gibson himself was in fact a vampire. Now, when he died, it is said his grave was actually placed outside the boundaries of the family Gibson cemetery. All that cemetery was surrounded by a fence, but his grave was surrounded by an iron fence. Some even say a concrete slab was placed on top of the grave to weight it down. The iron fence around, if you know spiritualism and stuff, the iron is to contain the spirit. So obviously the people of the community felt there was a vampire possibly tied here.
And the stuff I read, I guess they hung crosses on the fence.
I guess that was kind of a tradition for decades, was if you would go and visit this there on the iron gates around it, people would just randomly come up and hang crosses, homemade crosses, carved wood crosses, necklaces. Again, just really tying that fact in that whether he was or wasn't, the people around there definitely believed he was a vampire. Now, the concrete slab, the iron fence, it seems to all be gone today. Time-lapsed, we're talking many, many decades past. The fence, one of the farmers said they had to remove because there was a tree that had started growing and was actually growing up through it, and it was pulling it and all of this. They have recently uncovered two concrete slabs. Either one could be the concrete slab over said grave. But again, as most country rural cemeteries of that time frame, record keeping's not the best.
The urban legend in the area, which I believe the teenagers still pursue, that graveyard is still supposedly out there in the woods, fully fenced, and you can go there and you feel like you're being watched when you're there.
I actually watched a YouTube video that took place just about 3 months ago, and a pair of ladies went up and did a paranormal investigation, and they described exactly some of those same things while they were there. And they went in daylight. We'll say that. They had to get permission. Here in Missouri, you can't keep people from going to a private cemetery, but if it is landlocked, you have to get permission to travel across their property to get to said cemetery.
I thought cemeteries were private property.
It all depends on exactly where it is at, but my family actually had an old family cemetery, not our family, but had bought some property, and there was a lot of people that would come and visit, especially like around Memorial Day and stuff. The laws are very open that you can't keep someone from coming to pay their respects. But if it is landlocked and you've got to cross someone's property, you should always seek that permission first.
I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah. And honestly, you should anyhow. They got cattle and stuff. And that was what the problem was with this was it wasn't the fact that people were going there and visiting or even vandalizing. They'd leave the gates open and the cattle would get out and the cattle would get on the road. And,
yeah, that'd be a problem.
You got to consider all this stuff. But honestly, time has not been nice to the old cemetery. Between various vandals breaking many of the old tombstones, trees that have now uprooted many of them, hiding the remnants beneath the piles of the leaves, it's quite hard to get a good guess of how large the original cemetery was. It is believed most of the graves were dug in the early 1900s and speculated there may be as many as 250 or more total graves. We're not talking a small cemetery. Many of those, however, are unmarked. As of 2022, a local genealogical historical site had went in and identified at least 175 confirmed graves at the site. So again, we're not talking a small cemetery. Again, 175 confirmed of possibly 250 or more. Now on file, it states the cemetery is about 2.5 acres in size, which tends to kind of add credence to how many graves could in fact be there. You must also take into effect that, as tradition was at the time, many families, being poor, often could not afford a tombstone, so they would mark their loved one's grave by simply planting a tree or a shrub. And now some of those trees and shrubs have grown up and even destroyed some of the other grave markers and stuff that was around them. The cemetery lore says regardless if the wind is blowing, even if the wind is not, the twigs and limbs will still move. They will hit one another almost as if intentionally striking two twigs or two branches together, adding to that creepiness. Spectral figures, shadowy figures, can also be seen out of the peripheral vision of your eyes. Also reported are bangs and clicks, almost like a miner's hammer striking a rock deep from beneath the earth. One lady that was there doing a paranormal investigation had a ghost box, one of the ones that pop up words and stuff.
I want one of those.
Oh, I would too. I think those would be fun to play with. But she was asking questions, in particular about the possible vampire. Mr. Gibson, are you here with us? Were you a vampire? And they had a motion sensor that went off that they had kind of around their area. They both said at the same time in unison, did you feel that? And later on, they were describing what they think set off the motion detector was a vibration from beneath the ground that the strike or hit of a simulated pickaxe or hammer on a rock beneath them is what actually set that off. I thought that was kind of interesting. I had never heard that before. Doing some deep dive research, you can also find a daughter of Orland Gibson and his twin boys are all three said to be buried within that cemetery. Now, I want to give credit to an online page called The Dead History, The Vampire of Gibson Cemetery. This was an article written by Jennifer Jones, where I got a large portion of my research and that I've derived from there. In that article, it states, Gibson Cemetery saw its first internment sometime after 1824, when the Gibson family made their homestead in this area. The cemetery was initially just for the Gibson family, as I had said before, but eventually began to be used by people from the surrounding towns of Flat River, River Mines, and Elvins. The exact number of those buried there, as I said, kind of differs, but we know at least 175, as many as 250. Now, a lot of these are from these small mining towns in the area. That whole area became known as the Lead Belt. Missouri Department of Natural Resources, still to this day, calls it that. A lot of the miners were immigrants, many of whom were from Hungary. They were often referred to as hunkies by local people, and were given the worst jobs in the mines, and that was of shoveling. It was difficult, back-breaking work, and they were only paid about 30 cents an hour back in the day. Now, again, this is late 1890s, early 1900s. From 1910 until approximately 1920, as I had stated, an unusual number of children died. Rumors began that one of the Hungarian miners was a vampire. He was said to have lived in the town of Elvins, and the locals believed that somehow he was responsible for the deaths of these children. Now, doing a little bit of dive, some of these children just became sick or ill and literally died in their beds in their home, which sounds possibly of tuberculosis, common diseases and stuff of the time.
When I did this story, just the folktale part of it, that's kind of what I took away from what I was reading, was that there was just illness in the town. The kids weren't dying because they were being vampirized.
Yeah, it wasn't like they were finding bite marks on their neck and drained of their blood. But again, it's very easy to point a finger, especially at a possibly unusual looking Hungarian immigrant who obviously, we're horrible people in America. We treat nationalities differently. Back then it was much worse.
Yeah, it's not like it's
gotten better. We're still not there.
Not that it's gotten worse, for sure. It used to be a lot worse.
But, you can kind of see the finger pointing and, he did it, he killed my child. But there was quite a few tales of children that just wandered off into the woods and were lost.
To be fair, though, if it's a mining area, they
could have fallen in a hole.
They still have to block off old mines. They still find old mines. I watched an episode of Dirty Jobs where that was all they did for part of the episode, was they would find these old mines that were still open and block them off.
Yeah. So knowing what we know today, science and education has taken us a lot of places, not all good, but I think a lot of this stuff could be explained away. But at the time, it caused massive hysteria. we know for a fact in 1917, this area saw a diphtheria epidemic, which claimed hundreds, if not thousands, of especially young children's and the elderly's lives. Many children died from diseases that are now preventable, Depending on what you want to believe, a paranormal research team visited the grave, as I said, just a few months ago with the spirit voice box during the daylight hours. They'd gained permission. Some of the things I thought was interesting that came out of that paranormal research with the voice box, they got the words twins, which again, the twin boys are said to be buried there. They got the word doctor, which they took as they felt someone was ill, possibly needing a doctor. To our knowledge, there's not a doctor buried there, but again, who's to say? The next one was two words put together, and it said, people run. And I was like, well, you'd never probably want to hear that one. You're on a paranormal ghost research.
Well, maybe the people ran from him when they saw him.
And that is exactly what they thought. They thought possibly alluding to a haunting where people had come to the cemetery and then they fled because, hey, we're here to find some ghosts. Oh, crap, we found some ghosts. Let's run, kind of deal. And the fourth one was lonely. And obviously, if you're in a cemetery, especially growed up, almost forgotten, you could definitely see how many spirits might feel that they were left alone and lonely. As I had mentioned in the description of the Gibson man, a Hungarian immigrant, he had white hair, pale white skin, red eyes, and did not like daylight. It is said that he could have a nasty disposition. He was not trusted, even though everyone said he was a very hard worker. They accused him of luring these small children to his home and killing them. I never found any proof of that. I think that was, again, just kind of the mass hysteria that was going on. Now, many of these traits, as we had talked about, is definitely a telltale sign of albinism. The man also fitting the literal description of being an albino with white skin, pink or red eyes today. So it's a very credible possibility. Now, regardless, it's very clear with any amount of research, this man was feared. He was not well liked at all. And this brings me to even a bit more chilling aspect of the story on what actually caused the Hungarian immigrant's death. One-time local account states there's two possibilities of what actually did him in. The first, the old man just lived out his years and died of natural causes. His grave was placed outside the cemetery. That part is considered factual because many of the small children's graves, presumed victims, were buried inside that cemetery gate. I could kind of understand, again, with people being people back then, he's not going to be buried in there with my kid. He's the one that caused that death. So he's going to have to be buried outside. Okay. That kind of makes sense. I could see that. The second story is a bit more sinister, but also equally or more so believable, especially for the time frame of this little to no education regarding especially the medical field and possibly this whole albinoism. And that story was the terrified parents of many of these children who had perished. And keep in mind that could have been from scarlet fever or similar illness, but he was getting the blame, did a good old-fashioned lynch mobbing and burst into the immigrant's home one night and drug him out by horse, by some accounts, drug him through the city street to the Gibson cemetery where they hung him at a tree that was outside the cemetery and left him to hang for many weeks. And eventually someone buried the poor soul, and that is how he ended up outside of the cemetery gates.
And that's how you get Freddy Krueger.
That's exactly how we get Freddy Krueger. Stay tuned for our next episode. No, just kidding.
Well, I found a neat little story from Nebraska, and to kind of set the stage, imagine the Badlands out there, kind of cast your mind back a few years to the Old West days with cattle drives and things like that. Towards the end of 1895, locals began to find herds of cattle, and the men who tended to them brutally attacked overnight. Even wild animals would be brutalized by whatever was attacking these cattle and the cattlemen involved. It became apparent that the attacker was human, a man that many said was a vampire. When witnessed, the attacker would hunt and kill his prey using only his bare hands. He would then wrestle animals to the ground and tear the creatures apart with his bare hands with seemingly unnatural strength. and many times he was witnessed lapping up the blood of his prey like a dog would lap water.
Ew.
Now, the stories began to circulate that this person was a madman or maybe diseased. There was something clearly wrong with this guy.
Not normal.
Now, no one knows for sure the man's origins, though he was seen many times in December of 1895. Many tried to capture the man or the man-like beast to no avail. And the one notable story that I found quite often was that of Jack Lewis. Jack Lewis was a cowboy working around the Black Hills area, and he had wandered away from his companions for a bit for some personal time. And after he had dismounted and settled in to meditate, which was apparently his way of just relaxing and resetting for the day, this was towards evening, almost full dark at this point. Out of the shadows leaped the vampire, knocking Jack to the ground. The beast began to alternate between clawing at his neck and trying to bite at his skin and trying to choke him. So he's trying to subdue Jack. Now, Jack manages to pull his gun and fires off a couple of shots. No one can 100% say whether or not he hit the man, but if he did, the shots had no effect. Now, the gunfire, of course, attracted Jack's companions, who quickly came to his aid. The vampire fled into the night when they arrived, but the cowboys quickly mounted up and proceeded to pursue him on horseback. Now, the beast was able to elude his captors, kind of snaked around, and once it got full dark, they just lost him entirely. He disappeared into the darkness. Now, Jack survived the attack, though his face and neck were badly torn by the man's teeth, and he described the attacker to his friends as frothing at the mouth while he tried to bite him. So, of course, they were concerned. They were alarmed. They thought it was obvious that disease might be a real motivator for the man's strange behavior.
Maybe rabid.
But Jack Lewis luckily never showed any signs of infection after the attack. Now, the man or the beast seemed to have been driven off at some point or just left by the end of December, and the vampire of Pine Ridge, as he's been dubbed over the years, was never seen again come January. And this wild man attacking wild animals,
Wild
and cattle,
West
and cowboys.
vampire story.
Yeah, it's a neat story. I like that one.
My next story is one taken from the Smithsonian Magazine from October 2012. The article was written by Abigail Tucker and is titled The Great New England Vampire Panic and takes place in a town of Griswold, Connecticut. 200 years after the Salem witch trials, farmers became convinced that their relatives were returning from the grave to feed on the living.
Man, them New Englanders will panic over everything, won't they?
My gosh, hands up. Yeah, screaming, hollering. Here's how the chilling story unfolded. Some children were playing near a hillside gravel mine, and they found the first graves. One ran home to tell his mother, who was skeptical at first, until the boy reached in and in a bag produced a human skull.
Wow.
Hey, Mom, look at this. Because this was Griswold, Connecticut in 1990, police initially thought the burials might be the work of a local serial killer named Michael Ross, and they taped off the area and considered it a crime scene. But the brown, decaying bones turned out to be more than a century old. The Connecticut state archaeologist, Nick Belmonte, soon determined that the hillside contained a colonial-era farm cemetery. Now, New England is full of such unmarked family plots and graves, and the 29 burials were typical of the 1700s to early 1800s era. The dead, many of them were children, were laid to rest in inexpensive, plain, simple wood coffins. Now, they didn't have jewelry or even much clothing. Their arms were resting by their sides or crossed over their chest. Very traditional, poor family, 1700 to 1800s grave sites. That is, with the exception of burial site number 4 in particular. Nick Belmonte, the state archaeologist, was interested in the grave even before the excavation began. It was one of only 2 stone crypts in the cemetery, and it was partially visible from the mine face, meaning that you could see it. It was one of the first ones that they uncovered. Now, scraping away the soil with a flat-edged shovels and using the brushes and bamboo picks and such, the archaeologist and his team worked through several feet of earth before reaching the top of the crypt. It is then Bellatoni lifted the first of the large flat rocks that formed the roof. He uncovered the remains of a red-painted coffin and a pair of skeletal feet. They lay, he remembers, in perfect natural resting position. So as he's uncovering this, he comes to the foot, the base of the crypt first. I'm assuming these flat stones were in pieces. It could have been a solid one that broke, wasn't real clear. But he's removed just the one exposing the feet. As they continued to dig around, they worked their way up, removing, the knees, the torso, the chest. and he saw the rest had been completely rearranged. The skeleton had been beheaded. The skull and thigh bones now rested atop the rib cage and the vertebra. It looked like a skull and crossbones motif, the Jolly Roger symbol basically of pirate history. He says, I have never seen anything like it in all the archaeological digs, and he had done a lot of them, had been involved with a lot of them here in the New England states. Forensic analysis showed that the beheading, along with the other injuries, including the rib fractures, occurred roughly 5 years after the death. So somebody had also went in and smashed the coffin and obviously brutalized this corpse. The other skeletons in the gravel hillside were packaged for reburial, but not JB, as the 50-ish male skeleton from the 1830s came to be called, because of the initials spelled out in brass tacks on his coffin lid. Now, he was shipped to the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. for further study. Meanwhile, Beltoni invited archaeologists and historians to tour the excavation site. He was soliciting any theories. Was it simple vandalism? It seemed unlikely, as did robbery, because there was a lack of valuables at the site, nor any sign that there had ever been any valuables at the site. Finally, one colleague asked, I hate to even mention this, but have you heard of the Jewett City vampires? In 1854, apparently a neighboring Jewett City, Connecticut, townspeople had exhumed several corpses suspected to be vampires that were rising from their graves to kill the living. A few newspaper accounts of these events had survived. Had the Griswold grave been desecrated for the same reason? It seemed plausible. In one course of this bizarre research, Bellatoni placed a sincere yet awkward phone call to a Michael Bell, an X-Files style Rhode Island folklorist who had devoted much of his previous decade to studying New England vampire exhumations. So yeah, the X-Files or similar researchers do exist, and yes, they are called in from time to time to help authorities on cases. That's pretty cool. I want that job. Rhode Island, where multiple exhumations had occurred, many of these other vampires, like JB, had been violated and grotesquely tampered with and then reburied. In light of the tales Bell told of the mutilated corpses, even the posthumous rib fractures begin to make sense. JB's accusers had likely rummaged around in his chest cavity, hoping to remove and perhaps to burn his heart 5 years after his death. I wouldn't imagine there would be a whole lot left in those days. Now, while it sounds bizarre, as with some of our other vampire stories, there are several things that tie these cases together, as well as almost all vampire stories. Rural areas, check. Generally uneducated population, check. With many not even knowing how to read or write. With strict religious beliefs often going back to the old country, check. Humans seem to often fall back on what they are taught, what is familiar, sprinkled with some panic and maybe a little misunderstanding, or perhaps what could have been a real-life menacing monster living amongst them or nearby their village or town. If anything goes wrong, especially with illness, disappearances, death, fingers are quickly to point to anything that is misunderstood. And still to this day, if we don't know what it is, we want to kill it. Then the vigilante justice comes, often, unfortunately, led by a minister or a church person of the cloth, leading the terrified citizens, and things just unravel very, very quickly. And that is what we believe happened to JB, as well as some of these other New England sites where the Vandals dug up graves and cast their ribs and looked for hearts and did the Jolly Roger symbols on them. And wow.
The thing is if you go back to the old country, if you will, they all the time unearth bodies that are decapitated or
violated
some other way. I think there was one that had a brick in its mouth, or
oh yeah, I remember that one.
They found stakes wedged through rib cages. I mean,
the thought with the brick in the mouth was we'll fill its mouth so it can't bite again.
My favorite little piece of vampire folklore, as far as like the weird way of keeping them from getting to you, is that vampires have to stop and count things. So if you scatter like a handful of rice,
kind
of
like a leprechaun. I think leprechauns have that as well.
But yeah, they'll have to stop and count it.
Just go on a vampire hunt. We don't need Van Helsing. grab me a bag of
There's-
ball bearings or something.
There's an episode of X-Files, since you mentioned X-Files,
X-Files.
that has vampires in it, and one of the vampires comes for Mulder, and that's what he does. He throws down a handful of rice, and the vampire's all scary, it's all, and he throws down the rice, and the vampire stops. Man, why'd you do that? And he he gets down on his hands at 1, 2, 3.
By the time he's done, go, oh,
Yeah,
man.
and Mulder's gone. So the last story that I have is that of the Mineral Point vampire. So Mineral Point, Wisconsin is one of the oldest cities in the United States, and in the 1800s it relied very heavily on mining. A lot of mines,
a lot of mining stories tonight.
That's where it's underground, right?
Yeah,
It's
it
underground, it's always dark.
It fits.
Be a good place for vampires. But this isn't in the 1800s. The first story is on the evening of March 14th, 1981.
Not so long ago.
Police in Mineral Point, Wisconsin responded to reports of a strange man lurking in Graceland Cemetery.
Oh, I remember you telling me this. This one's an intriguing one.
Now, while on the scene, Officer John Pepper approached a tall, pale, darkly clad person. In Pepper's own words, a huge person wearing a black cape with white painted face, about 6'5" and ugly.
And ugly.
Now, when Officer Pepper asked the figure what he was doing, the figure turned and ran off into the darkness. There was snow on the ground, I believe they said, so the officer followed, and the chase ended when the pale figure leapt over a 6-foot-tall barbed wire fence at the edge of the cemetery.
Not climbed, leapt
Yeah.
over.
And into the adjacent cow pasture. I would assume that's why it was barbed wire. Now, the officer, of course, kind of noped out of there, went back to his squad car to report in, and he and a group of officers returned the next morning to attempt to follow the tracks. When they got to the place where the vampire had jumped over the fence, they found the tracks ended on the cemetery side, but did not continue anywhere on the other side of the fence. There were no
That's
tracks in the snow.
Weird. Yeah, if there was snow down, especially.
So after this, the town apparently came alive with vampire fever. Alive, undead, I'm not sure what the right word would be. And over the next 2 days, which did unfortunately happen to include April 1st, the police were buried in stories of lurking
I love the dad jokes.
They were buried in stories of lurking vampire-like figures hiding in the shadows. Now, it didn't help that some locals thought it would be a good idea to show up to local bars dressed as vampires.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, when you've already got the cops on edge.
Yeah.
So now, 23 years later, in March of 2004, police responded to reports of a dark-clad, pale individual sitting in a tree outside of an apartment complex, jumping down at the people passing by.
23 years later.
23 years.
Just perched up in a tree.
When police arrived on the scene, the 6-foot-tall individual fled. An officer followed, but quickly lost sight of the figure. Now, luckily, again, March, there's snow on the ground, and the tracks were easy to follow. Police followed these footprints all the way up to a 10-foot concrete wall,
Here we go.
where they abruptly came to an end. No other way out. In 2008, the third and really the most frightening episode in this vampire story happens. On July 11th, about 10 p.m., Brandon Hines, 22, and his girlfriend, Jamie Marker, 19, were fishing off the pier on the far west shore of Ludden Lake, nearby Mineral Springs. Perfectly normal thing
Sounds
to do.
nice.
Yeah, I mean, getting away. They were just fishing, minding their own business, when they heard noises coming from under the pier.
Not so nice.
They described the noises as, quote, like something was using the boards of the pier like a ladder, climbing along underneath us.
Creepy.
Now, Hines began stomping on the pier, believing it to be some kind of animal and trying to scare it off, so before it came to them, don't know what's down there. And he aimed his flashlight down between the cracks to try to see what was going on, what's underneath the pier here. He saw a caped figure climbing along, again, on the underside of the pier, using it like a ladder,
Wow.
with a pale white face.
Peekaboo.
So, of course, he kind of got scared and kind of looked away for a moment. And
Kind
then-
of got scared.
Then they heard water splashing towards the side of the pier, the other side from where they were standing. And when he turned and directed his flashlight towards the noise, he saw, quote, a figure with dark hair and a very pale face pulling itself onto the pier
Ooh.
from underneath.
This is like a B-rated
This is
vampire
scary.
horror film.
Yeah, like if you saw this. Now, the two stood up in shock as the figure rose up to its full height, like the other stories, over 6 foot tall.
I can so see that just like just
Oh,
coming
yeah.
up on the...
Yeah, that's like Salem's Lot or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, Jamie turned and ran up the path towards Hines' car. Hines was sort of frozen for a moment. He stood there, kept his flashlight aimed at the creature. He said it was wearing
That's why men die. Women know to run, get the car.
Yeah, she was smart. He said it was wearing some kind of Dracula-looking cape and suit. Now, of course, Hines finally, unfrozen from his terror, threw his flashlight at the figure, I guess to try to drive it off.
I hope this is a grenade. Maybe it's silver. I don't know.
And then he turned and he ran back up to the car where Jamie was already inside with the doors locked.
I beat you.
She's not messing around. Now, she finally let Brandon in the car, and as he got in, he was starting it. He started to pull out to leave. Jamie was looking out the window and saw the figure running up the path towards them as they were pulling out. Whoever this is out to get him. Now, they took off. They drove straight to the Mineral Point Police Department, and they made a statement. 2 patrol units were dispatched to the pier, and they found only abandoned fishing gear on the pier. Jamie and Brandon returned the next day to get their fishing gear during daylight hours, of course. They found everything except for the flashlight. And Hines is quoted as saying, "Whoever it is, they can keep it." That one is some scary movie level.
Yeah, definitely. Somebody ought to take that and make a movie out of that. So, Bill, is it time for headlines?
I found a really cool one. I really liked it. As part of the research, when we decided Springfield wasn't going to be enough, and then we quickly decided Missouri wasn't going to be enough, I just started plugging in nearby states and the word vampire.
Gotcha.
Kansas vampire, which I did find a cool story that we may cover later. Nebraska vampire. That's how I found the one guy. I typed in Tennessee vampire and found an interesting story. There's not a lot to support it, but I thought it would make a good headline.
Go for it.
This is from the East Tennessean Online by Elias Murphy, dated January 31st, 2023, entitled Cryptids of the South, The Legend of Old Butler. While the author was watching Twilight with a group of friends, it reignited their interest in vampires. And while talking to their friends about vampires, the author remembered the story of Butler, Tennessee. They knew immediately that they were going to write an article about this. They remembered the story and thought, well, this is an interesting thing. It was listed as an editorial in the article, so again, this isn't meant to be journalism. This is an opinion piece, basically. Now, the story is unverified. The only proof the author has of its existence is that it was told to them when they were younger, and that when they've brought it up since, there were a few others in the area that had heard parts of the story. They knew some of this. But the story of Old Butler is, at its core, a pretty simple one. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, is the company that started building the Watauga Dam. And the TVA is responsible for the dams and such in Tennessee. TVA pops up a lot when you look at the man-made lakes in the region.
Sure.
Now, apparently the area was prone to regular flooding anyway, and so to try to minimize the damage, I guess the TVA just decided to flood the whole valley. And that way, flooding would be kept to a minimum at that point overall. So they started this project in 1942. After an extended period of time due to World War II and then resident refusals, the TVA finally began flooding the town of Old Butler on January 1st, 1948, and they relocated all the townsfolk to where the city of Butler is today. Now, Butler is called the town that wouldn't drown.
I like that. Rolls off the tongue nicely.
Well, again, for multiple reasons. Again, there was a lot of flooding in the days, but Butler always came back and recovered. There were multiple delays in the construction of the Watauga Dam, so, they tried to drown it and it wouldn't drown. And apparently, even over the years, droughts have caused the lake levels to drop dramatically, and Old Butler has sort of resurfaced over the years. Now, that's the story of Butler, but the folklore and the reason why it ties in so well to this, there is apparently, according to local lore, an alternative reason why the TVA wanted to flood the town of Old Butler.
Ooh, this sounds juicy.
Now, there are no resources to verify the truth of this story. Obviously, no one in the TVA is copping to, why we did this. But the author did hear from a handful of people in the town that there is an alternative reason. That reason, vampires. Legend says that the town suffered from an infestation of vampires, and despite the efforts of the townsfolk, they just could not get rid of the monsters, which ultimately led to the flooding of the town. Though, of course, that may not have entirely solved the problem. Like I said before, due to droughts and things, the town has resurfaced from time to time. It's resurfaced at least twice in recorded history. And local legend states that should the town be exposed for long enough, the vampires will come back.
This is another great movie concept.
Yeah, that would be a heck of a scary movie.
Oh my gosh.
Again, you got a real Salem's Lot kind of haunted vampire town vibe here.
The city that will not die. All right. Well, my headline, I decided I'm going to beat this one story to death, all puns included. I'm going to follow up with the Elvin's Immigrant Vampire story because it just so happened I stumbled across an article online called The Graveyard Dance was the channel, and it was from 2022. Only about a year and a half ago, honestly. So the host, name not given, so it's again, kind of like yours, it's kind of vague, but stated that he traveled there to Elvins, Missouri, and wanted to interview some of the people around there and get some firsthand accounts of this possible alleged vampire of the Hungarian immigrant. And he came across one particular interview that just kind of stuck in his mind, and he shared on the Graveyard Dance on his show. The now 40-year-old man was telling the interviewer that another young man and 2 young girls had went to the cemetery many, many years ago with a Ouija board. Now, we've talked about Ouija boards before.
Whole episode
on that. Now, no names were given to keep them anonymous. Sounded like this was something they did probably when they were in high school or, still in school regardless. Once I get into the story, you'll understand probably why the names were omitted. For one, they did not have permission to be there. They were trespassing.
Yeah, you don't want that getting out.
It was not in the daylight hours. It was at night. They stated that they had went out with lanterns and candles, one of which the wind flickered and actually caught some leaves on fire, but they got the fire out. So
could have been bad.
There's some reasons why the names were not given, and I understand, but that's all too typical, with a lot of these articles and things that we find. That's why we call it lore and legend. But anyhow, they had snuck into the cemetery with a Ouija board, and they had tried to make contact. And they all believed they did, in fact, have some success in doing that particular night. Now, they point out that all 4 of them ended up running from the cemetery, which is ironic because I did mention one of the deals in the voice box was, people run. The whole group, jumped over the fence, ran through the gate. They said they just went every which way, got to their truck, and sped off into the night. The other young man, not the one they're interviewing, obviously, who is the owner of the Ouija board. He had decided to bring the Ouija board that night. It was totally his idea. And so he took it back home with him. And within 48 hours, he was found dead for unknown reasons.
Wow.
In his house. The remaining 3, now adults, as I said, in their 40s, believed that night they had brought something back with them from the cemetery that night. In particular, something came back with or attached to that Ouija board. And they have refused in all the years that followed to ever return to that cemetery site. I thought that was a bit creepy and very fitting for a headline.
So starting with this episode, we always try to end with a question. I think Eric and I are both going to present questions. So I'm going to go ahead and take the lead here, I guess.
What's your question?
Just going to presume that Eric's going to let me do.
I'm staring at him across the table.
What's your take on vampires? Do they exist? Are they just folklore? And 2-part. Would you become one if you were offered the chance?
Oh, wow. All honesty, at my age, my research, no, I do not believe vampires are real.
Now I'll counter with, and I'm going to go back to when we talk about Bigfoot and whatnot.
Yeah.
And this will be, part of my answer. Every culture has a story about something vampiric. Some creature that comes back from the dead or something that attacks in the night, drains blood, weakens people.
I believe there are... I can't believe I'm going to say this, Bill. I'm taking the other side, but I think there's more scientific other reasons to better explained than the whole folklorish, it's a vampire. For example, we now know that, especially in hoodoo and voodoo, there are herbs and things that you can grind up and make a person immolate death. I mean, no pulse, no nothing. They could bury them, dig them back up, and it looks like they're zombies. They've risen from the dead. Albinoism, as we've talked tonight. I just think there are some other things, and I think it's more of a paranoia. While I do agree with you, they're everywhere. The tales are in every country across the
Everybody's
world.
got the story.
That is a bit hard to debunk or whatever, but I'm going to say no. I do not believe in the full-fledged, Bram Stoker's Dracula version. And would I become that if I had a chance?
Would you be born into darkness, Eric?
10 years ago, I would have said, where do I sign up? If I died today and became back a vampire, because you can't go back in time, you're created at whatever age you are, and then you're stuck there.
You would want to be a
I
younger man?
hurt too bad right now. My bones and joints, there's no way I would want to sign up for the long-term ticket for that.
I'm like you. You go back 10, 20 years, I would have made, it would have to be more than 10 now. Let's say 20 years. You go back 20-something years, and I would have been all about that.
Yes.
But before I met my family, of course.
Yes.
Or my wife and had my family,
yes.
I should say. I didn't meet
Totally.
my family before they existed. When I was
totally with you.
when I was playing Vampire the Masquerade, oh yeah, I would have signed on in a heartbeat. But I do want to quote Queen here. Who wants to live forever? I can't imagine that has any kind of upside at this point in my
It would be
life.
horrific watching all the people that you know and love just die and fade, and you're just stuck there.
I used to joke when I worked exclusively night shift, especially in the short winter days. I go to work and it's dark. I come home and it's dark. I could be a vampire.
We were vampires for many decades working
Yeah.
night shift.
Although if I was going to be a vampire, God, I could come up with something better than working in a factory.
You got that right. All right, Bill. So my question today, right now, what if I told you someone came to me and they said, I think I know where a vampire's buried. We own this old country property, this old farm, and it's this old cemetery. And, you know, we've got all these old newspaper articles and all this stuff. We've been doing this research, and I know it's illegal, but, you know, this person has asked me and anybody that I could get to come out and dig up this old grave. And I give you the invite to do so, Bill. Now, obviously, this is under the shadows of night. Total zip the lip. We don't talk about it. Would you do it?
Buddy, I throw on that necklace of garlic bulbs. I grab the crucifix. I get a couple of stakes. I'll look like that scene where they're gearing up in The Lost Boys. With like the bandolier and the stakes and all that.
Bandolier of garlic and holy water and the squirt guns. And
100%. Like, again, I would bust out that old vampire book. I would find all the lore about how you repel them, and I would have I'd bring a bag of rice. I'd have, you name it. I'd be on board.
You would make me so proud because I wouldn't be there alone then.
I would absolutely, but again, I would go prepared. I would take every bit of lore I've ever known and just in case.
Just
They'd
in
be
case.
like, oh, I don't think, what is Mountain Ash? I never, you know what? I'm not taking chances.
And Bill would be mocking me as I'm kind of shaking there in the moonlight. You just said you didn't believe vampires were real. What are you so scared for?
Then it'd be like that scene in Dracula Dead and Loving It where they hammer the stake and just get doused in gallons of blood.
Yeah. Blah.
Yeah, don't get me wrong now. In full honesty, if we get there and you open the casket and the eyes pop open, yeah, I may pass out or soil myself. Or,
You don't have to be the fastest. You just don't want to be the slowest.
Yeah, you don't have to outrun the bear. You just got to trip the guy next to you. Like, no offense, Eric.
Yeah. Yep. I got you. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed yet another installment of Nightmares on the Lost Highway. We appreciate each and every one of you that's listening out there.
Hey, real quick call to action. I think Eric would agree. We'd like to grow this Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
Absolutely.
If you could, if you're listening on Apple, if you would go and give us a review and rate us. If you have some feedback, that's fine too. Whatever platform you're listening, follow us, rate us, give us some reviews. That helps get some recognition and gets our name out there.
We do have a Facebook page, Nightmares on the Lost Highway. You can easily find us if you want to communicate with us. If you want to share some possibilities for future podcasts with us, reach out. We want to talk with you guys. The cemetery lore says that regardless, if the wind is blowing, often twigs and limbs will move. Spectral figures and shadows might be seen out of the peripheral vision of your eyes.
If the wind is blowing, twigs will move, or if the wind's not blowing.
If the wind is not blowing,
Okay.
twigs and stuff will still move.
You said if the wind is blowing.
Oh,
You'll need
okay.
to redo that. Because I was like, well, of course they'll move.
Well,
The
of
wind's
course they
blowing.
will. Then, of course, we have to remember that, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
You said stroker. That's an entirely different. That's the porn parody.
Okay. I wasn't sure I wanted to put that in there.
The vampire bride scene, that's a whole different.
Yeah. Stroker. I'm going to leave that out anyway. I decided that was actually after a lot of this.
I want to take a time to thank the people that helped bring this all together. Alex Tudor, you can almost call him our producer at this point. Sarah Tudor, who also helps with some of the technical stuff. I want to take a moment to extend thanks to Eric for letting us use his space to record in, kind of our makeshift studio.
I, in turn, would like to thank Bill for, one, putting up with me and using this camaraderie to do something we both very much love and enjoy doing, and thank Bill's family for allowing him to spend all the time to work and clean up our recordings and present them in what you hear in the final terms, the final edition, if you will.
And I'd like to thank all of you for continuing to listen. I know we've got some loyal followers out there. We do this as a labor of love, but we're happy that there are people that enjoy it hopefully as much as we do.
Thank you very much.